What if the most uncomfortable moment of your career didn't happen on camera, but in the silence between takes? Let that sink in for a second. Because when people talk about hit TV shows, they remember the suits, the confidence, the sharp dialogue, the power walks down glossy hallways. They remember the characters, the fantasy, the polished final product. What they almost never talk about is what it feels like to be inside that machine while it's running. The pressure, the expectations, the unspoken rules, the moments where something feels wrong, but you can't quite name it yet. And what if years later, after the applause fades, after the contracts end, after the culture shifts, someone finally says, "I need to talk about what really happened"? That's where this story begins. Not with a courtroom scene, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a memory that wouldn't stay quiet anymore. For more than a decade, Suits has lived on as comfort television, sharp banter, power dynamics that felt thrilling instead of suffocating. A world where confidence always won and consequences always wrapped up neatly before the credits rolled. Millions watched, millions rewatched. And behind the scenes, careers were launched, images were built, and expectations were set in stone. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to admit. Television sets are not neutral spaces. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. They are hierarchies. They are pressure chambers. They are places where professionalism can sometimes be used as a shield to avoid difficult conversations. And when people look back years later and say, "Something about that didn't sit right with me," the question becomes, do we listen? Or do we scroll past because it disrupts the story we already decided to believe? This isn't a story about declaring guilt or innocence. It's a story about perspective, memory, power, and what happens when the line between acting and reality becomes dangerously unclear. Because according to later reflections, there were moments on that set that didn't feel like acting anymore. Moments that were interpreted very differently depending on where you stood, how much power you had, and how much you felt you could risk by speaking up. Think about that. How many times have you been in a situation where something made you uncomfortable, but you brushed it off because everyone else seemed fine? Because you didn't want to be difficult? Because you told yourself, "Maybe I'm overthinking this." Now imagine that feeling amplified by cameras, contracts, and the fear that one wrong move could end everything you've worked for. That's the environment we're talking about. Early success came fast, faster than anyone could process. One season, you're auditioning and wondering if your career will ever take off. The next, you're part of a global hit with expectations attached to every word you say and every move you make. When something feels off in that environment, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. It creeps in through small moments. A look held too long. A rehearsal note that feels personal instead of professional. A joke that lands differently in private than it does in public. At the time, those moments are easy to dismiss. You tell yourself it's just part of the job. You tell yourself this is how television works. You tell yourself everyone else seems okay, so maybe you should be too. But years later, when the noise dies down, those moments have a way of resurfacing. Clearer, heavier, harder to explain away. And that's where the discomfort really begins. Because when someone says, "I felt pressured," the world often hears, "I'm accusing." When someone says, "I was uncomfortable," the response is often, "Why didn't you say something then?" As if power dynamics freeze in time. As if fear expires the moment the cameras stop rolling. So why does this story matter now? Because the industry has changed. Because conversations about consent, boundaries, and power are no longer whispered, they're demanded. And because stories that once would have been buried under PR statements are now being re-examined with new eyes. But here's the twist most people don't expect. Not everyone involved remembers things the same way. Some recall professionalism. Some recall chemistry. Some recall nothing unusual at all. And some recall moments they didn't have language for back then, but do now. That's what makes this story complicated and uncomfortable and important. This isn't about shock for the sake of shock. It's about asking hard questions we've avoided for too long. What does consent look like in a workplace built on pretending? Who gets to define when a line has been crossed? And how many people stay silent because speaking up feels more dangerous than staying quiet? As viewers, we're conditioned to pick sides instantly. We're taught to decide who's right and who's wrong before we even hear the full story. But real life doesn't work like that. Real life is messy. Memory is imperfect. Power distorts everything. And sometimes, the most honest thing someone can say is, "This is how it felt to me." That's not a verdict. That's a confession of vulnerability. And yet, those words alone can change how we see everything. Because once you hear them, you can't unhear them. So as we move forward, ask yourself this. If the roles were reversed, if the pressure was on you, if your livelihood depended on staying agreeable, would you have spoken up? Or would you have done what so many people do and told yourself it was just acting? Because according to later reflections, there was a moment early on that set the tone for everything that followed. A moment that seemed small at the time, insignificant even, until it wasn't. And once that line blurred, it became harder and harder to tell where acting ended and reality quietly took over. What if the moment that changes everything doesn't announce itself as danger, but disguises itself as opportunity? That's the uncomfortable question hanging in the air as we move forward. Because the line didn't blur all at once. It didn't explode into chaos. It crept, quietly, politely, wrapped in praise, ambition, and the unspoken rule that you don't rock the boat when the boat is finally taking you somewhere. This is where the Real story begins. Before the headlines, before the rewatch culture, before anyone had the language they have now. Back then, it was just a set, a job, a chance that felt too big to lose. Imagine walking onto a production that suddenly realizes it has lightning in a bottle. The tone is electric. Everyone's excited. Writers are rewriting scenes on the fly. Producers are paying attention. The network is watching closely. And when a show starts to feel like a hit, everything speeds up. Schedules tighten. Expectations rise. Mistakes feel more expensive. And in that environment, nobody wants to be the person who says, "Hey, something about this feels off." Because here's the contradiction no one talks about. The same intensity that makes great television can also make boundaries fuzzy. You're encouraged to dig deeper, to push further, to bring more of yourself into the role. That's what commitment looks like, right? At least, that's how it's framed. Early on, the tone on set was described as professional, focused, serious about the work. There was a sense that everyone wanted this to succeed, and that meant trusting each other, trusting direction, trusting your scene partners, trusting the process. And trust is powerful, but trust can also disarm you. Because when you trust someone, you don't question every moment. You assume good intentions. You tell yourself that discomfort is just nerves or growth or part of doing something meaningful. So when a rehearsal moment lingers a second too long, you don't immediately label it as a problem. You label it as intensity. When a note feels personal, you tell yourself it's about the character. When a boundary isn't clearly discussed, you assume everyone understands it implicitly. After all, this is television. Everyone's a professional, right? Here's where things get complicated. On sets like this, power doesn't always look like authority. Sometimes it looks like confidence, experience, cultural weight, being the person everyone else seems to orbit around. And when you're early in your career, still proving yourself, that power imbalance doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. You feel it when you hesitate before speaking. You feel it when you rewrite your own discomfort as overthinking. You feel it when you tell yourself, "This is just how it's done." And that's the part most people miss. Discomfort doesn't always come with alarm bells. Sometimes it comes with self-doubt. Was that weird? Am I reading too much into this? Would anyone else even notice? Those questions loop in your head while the cameras keep rolling. And when you're surrounded by people who seem unfazed, it's easy to assume the problem must be you. This is where the idea of forced becomes dangerous territory in storytelling. Because force doesn't always look like physical coercion. Sometimes it looks like expectation, pressure, momentum. A situation where saying no feels heavier than saying yes. And that's not something you recognize in real time. That realization usually comes later, much later. Back then, it was just work. Or at least, that's what it was supposed to be. As the show found its rhythm, the performances became more layered. Scenes leaned into chemistry. Writers explored tension. Directors encouraged authenticity. The language of the job rewarded closeness. Emotional vulnerability. Real reactions. All good things. Until they aren't. Because when authenticity becomes the goal, boundaries need to be clearer, not looser. And yet, clarity wasn't always there. Instead, there were assumptions. Assumptions about comfort. Assumptions about consent. Assumptions about what an actor should be willing to do for the sake of the scene. And when assumptions replace conversations, misunderstandings aren't just possible, they're inevitable. Here's a question for you. Have you ever agreed to something because it felt easier than explaining why you were uncomfortable? Not because you wanted to, but because stopping the momentum felt impossible. Now imagine that moment playing out under fluorescent lights, with a crew watching, with the unspoken knowledge that this show could define your career. That's not an abstract scenario. That's the reality many actors quietly navigate. And here's the twist. From the outside, everything looked fine. Scenes aired. Audiences applauded. Critics praised chemistry. The show kept getting renewed. Success became proof that whatever was happening behind the scenes must have been working. But success has a way of burying nuance. Because when a project is winning, nobody wants to disrupt the narrative. So moments that felt uncomfortable were reframed as dedication. Moments that crossed internal lines were dismissed as part of the craft. And moments that should have prompted conversation were swallowed by momentum. Until years later, when the momentum stops, that's when reflection begins. And reflection is brutal. Because once you have distance, you start asking different questions. Why did I feel that knot in my stomach? Why didn't I speak up? Why did I normalize something that didn't sit right with me? Those questions don't come with easy answers. They come with guilt, confusion, anger. Sometimes at others, sometimes at yourself. And that's another part of this story people struggle to accept. You can feel violated and still wonder if you're allowed to feel that way. You can be successful and still carry discomfort. You can participate willingly in a moment and later realize the conditions surrounding that willingness were compromised. That's not weakness. That's human. As time passed, the culture around these conversations changed. Words like boundaries and consent became part of the mainstream dialogue. Intimacy coordination became standard. Discussions that once felt taboo became necessary. And suddenly, people started re-examining their past through a new lens. Moments that were once brushed aside gained weight. And when that happens, silence becomes heavier than speech. But breaking silence is never simple. Because the moment you speak, you're no longer just sharing your experience. You're challenging a story people are attached to. Fans feel protective. Colleagues feel defensive. The internet feels entitled to a verdict. And that's why many people stay quiet. Not because nothing happened, but because saying something feels like stepping into a storm with no shelter. So when someone finally begins to hint that things weren't as simple as they looked, it's not usually a sudden decision. It's the result of years of internal debate, years of replaying moments, years of wondering whether it's worth reopening doors that were already closed. And here's where this chapter tightens. Because there was a specific early interaction, small on the surface, that later took on outsized meaning. A moment that didn't raise alarms at the time, but planted a seed. A moment that, in hindsight, marked the first time acting and reality felt too close for comfort. At the time, it was dismissed. Later, it became impossible to ignore. And once that realization set in, everything else began to look different. The jokes, the rehearsals, the notes that blurred into personal territory. It wasn't about one incident. It was about a pattern that only became visible once you stepped back far enough to see it. And that's the cruel irony. You can't protect yourself from something you don't yet understand. But once you do understand it, you can't go back to not knowing. Because the next part of this story isn't about what happened on camera. It's about what happened in the spaces in between. The pauses, the silences, the moments no script accounted for. And when those moments finally came into focus, they changed everything. What happens when the silence after a moment feels louder than anything that was said out loud? Because that's where this chapter picks up. Not in a scene, not in dialogue, but in the space afterward. The walk back to your mark, the shuffle of papers, the crew resetting lights while your mind is still trying to catch up with what just happened. This is the part people don't see. When the director calls cut and everyone exhales, there's an assumption that the tension belongs to the characters, not the actors. That once the scene ends, the emotions go back in the box. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they follow you. They sit in your chest while you pretend everything's normal. And that's exactly what made this so confusing. Because on paper, nothing bad had happened. No shouting, no confrontation, no obvious line crossed that could be pointed to and explained in a sentence. And yet, Something felt different. Have you ever had a moment like that? Where you replay something in your head over and over, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle enough to make you doubt yourself. That's the danger zone. The danger zone is where discomfort hides behind professionalism. Early on, the set was described as efficient, focused. Everyone knew their job. There was pride in being part of something sharp and intelligent. The show demanded precision, and that precision extended to performances that relied heavily on chemistry. Chemistry, after all, was part of the appeal. Audiences didn't just want sharp dialogue. They wanted tension, connection, that intangible spark that makes a scene feel alive. And when a show starts getting praised for that spark, it becomes something you're expected to maintain. So when a director leans in and says, "Let's push this a little further," it sounds reasonable. When a scene partner suggests an adjustment, it sounds collaborative. When something makes you hesitate, it's easy to interpret that hesitation as fear of not delivering, rather than a boundary being nudged. That's how the middle ground disappears. Because the language of acting is full of phrases that encourage surrender. Trust the moment. Be present. Don't overthink. Let it happen. But here's the contradiction. Being present doesn't mean being unprotected. Yet at the time, protection wasn't a conversation anyone was really having. There were no structured check-ins, no standardized conversations about comfort levels, no clear protocol for stopping a scene without feeling like you were derailing the day. So everything relied on assumption. An assumption is a fragile foundation. One person assumes enthusiasm, another assumes obligation, and neither realizes they're standing on different ground. What made it harder was the reaction, or lack of reaction, from everyone else. Crew members did their jobs. Scenes moved forward. No alarms were raised. Which leads to a brutal internal question. If no one else seems bothered, is it still valid if I am? That question can eat at you. Because actors are trained to be self-critical, to question their instincts, to ask whether they're being too sensitive, too cautious, too precious about their process. And when your career is still gaining traction, the last thing you want is to be labeled difficult. So you adapt. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself it's part of the job. You tell yourself once the show settles, things will feel clearer. But clarity doesn't always come with time. Sometimes time just layers new moments on top of old ones, until the original feeling is buried under routine. Until one day, something snaps it back into focus. In this case, it wasn't a big blow-up. It was a comment. A small, offhand remark that reframed everything that came before it. Not malicious, not overt, just enough to make you pause and think, wait, what? And that pause mattered, because it forced a reevaluation. Suddenly, earlier moments felt heavier. Scenes that once felt collaborative now felt loaded. Notes that once seemed about performance felt personal in a way that was hard to articulate. That's when the internal calculus changes. You start asking yourself not just how to get through the day, but how to protect your sense of self inside the work. And here's where the power dynamic really shows its teeth. Protection often requires confrontation. Confrontation requires leverage, and leverage is not evenly distributed. So instead of addressing the discomfort directly, many people cope quietly. They adjust their behavior. They avoid certain conversations. They create emotional distance while maintaining professional closeness on camera. It's a strange split to live with. On screen, everything looks seamless. Off screen, you're managing tension no one acknowledges. And the irony is that audiences often praise the result. They call it electric. They call it authentic. They call it chemistry you can't fake. But what if part of that authenticity comes from unresolved discomfort? That's an uncomfortable thought, isn't it? Because it forces us to confront how often entertainment profits from blurred lines. Now, to be clear, not everyone involved experienced things the same way. Some remember nothing unusual. Some recall intense, but purely professional collaboration. Some may be genuinely surprised by later reflections. And that's what makes this story so volatile. Multiple truths can exist at once. One person's normal can be another person's quiet alarm. And the absence of malicious intent doesn't erase the presence of impact. This is where the passage of time becomes crucial. Years later, with But lived experiences don't fit into those boxes. So when someone finally begins to speak, even carefully, even tentatively, it's not because they've suddenly decided everything is clear. It's because the cost of staying silent has started to outweigh the cost of being misinterpreted. And that's a terrifying calculation. Because speaking doesn't just expose your story. It exposes your uncertainty, your doubt, your willingness to admit that you didn't have all the answers then and might not have them now. That level of honesty is risky, and yet, the cultural moment almost demands it. By the time this story starts circulating more widely, the industry is already deep into a reckoning. Stories are being revisited. Old interviews are being re-examined. Casual comments from years ago are being reframed through a modern lens. Nothing stays buried. And when that happens, even people who never intended to speak find themselves pulled into the conversation. That's when memory becomes a battleground. Because memory isn't a recording. It's interpretation layered over time. It shifts. It sharpens. It softens. It absorbs new context and discards old rationalizations. What once felt like confusion may later feel like clarity. What once felt like normal may later feel inappropriate. What once felt like nothing may later feel like something you wish you'd addressed. And when someone articulates that shift publicly, the response is rarely gentle. Some people listen. Some people dismiss. Some people attack. And many people project. They project their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own unresolved feelings onto a story that isn't theirs. That projection is powerful because it turns a personal reflection into a cultural Rorschach test. Everyone sees something different, and everyone is convinced they're right. So imagine trying to speak into that noise. Imagine trying to say, "This is how it felt to me," while knowing that sentence alone will be dissected word by word. Felt implies subjectivity. Subjectivity invites challenge. People ask for proof. They ask for timelines. They ask why you didn't act differently, speak sooner, react louder. They ask questions that ignore the reality of power dynamics and hindsight. And that's when frustration sets in, because explaining why you didn't speak up then requires explaining fear. And fear doesn't sound convincing to people who have never felt trapped by circumstance. It's easy to say what you would have done from a safe distance. Much harder to acknowledge what you did when your livelihood, reputation, and future were on the line. This is where the story takes a turn. Because as the conversation grows, others begin to respond. Not always directly, but through their own recollections, their own interpretations, their own sense of how things were. And suddenly, you're not just sharing your experience. You're being compared to someone else's. That comparison can feel invalidating, even when it's not meant to be. Because two people can live the same moment and walk away with entirely different impressions. And when one person says, "I didn't experience it that way," it can feel like an erasure, even if it's simply their truth. This is where public discourse struggles. We want a single, clean narrative, but reality offers overlapping ones. So the conversation fractures. Some people argue intent. Some argue impact. Some argue timing. Some argue motive. And in the middle of all of it is a person who originally just wanted to make sense of their own discomfort. That's the irony. The initial goal isn't to accuse. It isn't to destroy. It's to understand. But once the story enters the public sphere, intention no longer dictates outcome. The story becomes bigger than you. It gets pulled into think pieces, comment sections, reaction videos. People debate not just what happened, but whether you're allowed to feel the way you feel. And that's when another question emerges. Who owns a story once it's told? Does it still belong to the person who lived it? Or does it become communal property, shaped by whoever speaks the loudest? That question haunts this chapter. Because speaking doesn't bring closure. It brings exposure. It opens doors you didn't know how to close. And it forces you to watch as strangers argue over moments that once felt intensely personal. And yet, even with all of that, something shifts. Because once the silence is broken, it can't be restored. And even if the response is messy, even if the reaction is harsh, even if the nuance gets lost, there is a strange relief in no longer carrying the weight alone. Relief doesn't mean resolution. It just means the truth, however imperfect, is finally outside your head. But the cost of that relief is steep, because now others feel invited to respond. And the next phase of this story isn't driven by reflection or hesitation. It's driven by reaction. Statements. Clarifications. Carefully worded responses that try to say everything and nothing at the same time. And once those responses start circulating, the story accelerates in ways no one can control. Because the moment someone else speaks, the narrative shifts again. And what came next didn't just complicate the story. It polarized it. What happens when the story no longer belongs to one voice, but to many, all speaking at once? Because that's where everything fractures. This is the point where a personal reflection becomes a public collision, where careful wording meets instant interpretation, where people stop listening for understanding and start listening for ammunition. And it happens fast. One moment, the conversation is about experience. The next, it's about sides. Statements start appearing. Some are direct. Some are indirect. Some say a lot without saying much at all. Carefully chosen words. Neutral tones. Professional language designed to lower the temperature, not raise it. But here's the thing about public statements. They don't cool fires. They fuel speculation. Because every word that's said invites 10 questions that aren't answered. And every word that isn't said invites 100 more. People read between lines that may not even exist. They analyze pauses. They interpret phrasing. They compare past interviews to present ones, looking for contradictions that prove a point they've already decided on. And suddenly, memory becomes evidence. Old clips resurface. Old jokes get replayed. Old moments are reframed with a seriousness they never carried at the time. This is where the internet excels and fails. Because the internet doesn't ask, what was the environment like then? It asks, how does this make me feel now? And feelings spread faster than facts. So reactions explode. Some viewers express support. They say, thank you for speaking up. They recognize the complexity. They understand how power and pressure can warp consent without ever announcing itself. Others push back hard. They say, why now? They say, this doesn't match what I saw. They say, this feels exaggerated. And then there are those who go further. They turn discomfort into accusation. They turn reflection into indictment. They turn nuance into a verdict. Even when the person speaking never asked for one. This is the moment where things become dangerous. Because once the narrative hardens, it stops evolving. And it hardens fast. Comment sections fill with certainty. Not curiosity. Certainty. People speak in absolutes. They insist on clean conclusions in a story that refuses to be clean. You're either believed completely or dismissed entirely. There's no room for, I'm still figuring this out. But real processing takes time. And public discourse doesn't allow for that. So what does someone do in the middle of that storm? They retreat. Not physically, emotionally. Because the more noise there is, the harder it becomes to recognize your own voice. And here's the quiet irony. The louder the reaction, the less the original experience gets discussed. Instead of talking about workplace dynamics, the conversation becomes about credibility. Instead of discussing boundaries, it becomes about motives. Instead of examining systems, it becomes about personalities. And systems love that. Because when attention shifts to individuals, structures remain untouched. Think about it. How often do these conversations end with meaningful change instead of just spectacle? How often do we actually ask, what allowed this confusion to exist in the first place? The truth is, high-pressure creative environments thrive on ambiguity. Ambiguity allows flexibility, improvisation, spontaneity. But ambiguity also allows boundaries to go undefined. And when boundaries are undefined, misunderstandings aren't exceptions. They're features. This isn't about one set. This isn't about one show. This is about an industry that normalized emotional risk without formal safeguards for decades. Back then, if something felt wrong, the solution was often personal resilience. Tough it out. Be professional. Don't take it personally. Don't jeopardize the production. Those messages were rarely spoken directly. They were absorbed. And absorbed messages are hard to challenge because they feel like common sense. So when someone later questions that culture, it feels threatening, not because it's wrong, but because it destabilizes what people accepted as normal. That's why the reaction is so intense. It's not just about the story. It's about what the story implies. If this discomfort is valid, what else have we ignored? If this pressure mattered, who else felt it? If this environment was flawed, what does that say about the projects we love? Those are uncomfortable questions. So many people avoid them. They choose a side instead. And choosing a side is easier than sitting with uncertainty. This is where public response takes on a life of its own. Articles summarize. Podcasts speculate. Videos dissect facial expressions and tone. And in all of it, something subtle but important happens. The original language of uncertainty gets rewritten as certainty. I felt pressured becomes I was forced. I was uncomfortable becomes I was violated. I didn't have the words then becomes I'm changing my story now. That transformation isn't always intentional, but it's powerful. And once it happens, the person at the center of it may feel misrepresented by both sides at once. Too soft for some, too harsh for others, caught in the middle of interpretations that don't quite fit. This is where the emotional toll deepens. Because now, it's not just about the past. It's about watching people argue over your experience as if it's a thought experiment. Strangers weigh in with confidence. Friends are asked to comment. Colleagues feel pressured to clarify their own positions. And every response, no matter how neutral, adds fuel. Because neutrality is often read as avoidance. So the pressure builds for something more definitive. A clearer statement. A stronger stance. A final word. But closure doesn't work that way. Especially not when multiple truths exist. This is where many people underestimate the cost of speaking up. It doesn't end the conversation. It opens it. And once it's open, it can't be neatly closed again. Because even if no further statements are made, the story keeps circulating. It gets recycled. It gets referenced whenever the show comes up. Whenever the industry discusses change. Whenever similar stories emerge. It becomes part of the cultural record. And that's heavy. Imagine realizing that something you struggled to articulate privately is now something people will associate with your name indefinitely. Not because you wanted that legacy, but because the conversation outgrew your control. And yet, even with all of that, there's a strange, quiet shift happening underneath the noise. People are starting to ask better questions. Not just, who's right? But, why was this situation possible? Why were boundaries assumed instead of discussed? Why was discomfort something individuals had to manage alone? Why did success override safety for so long? Those questions don't trend as well, but they matter more. And they hint at something deeper. That this story isn't really about blame. It's about reckoning. Reckoning with an industry that valued output over process. Reckoning with a culture that celebrated intensity without guardrails. Reckoning with the idea that good intentions don't cancel harmful dynamics. That reckoning doesn't come with a neat ending. It comes with discomfort. And discomfort is where growth either begins or gets shut down. Right now, the industry is at a crossroads. Some people want to move on quickly. Others want accountability. Many want reassurance that their favorite stories aren't tainted. But the truth is, stories don't get tainted by reflection. They get deepened by it. And the next chapter of this story isn't about who said what. It's about what changed because someone said anything at all. Because behind the noise, behind the arguments, behind the polarized reactions, quiet shifts are happening. Policies, protocols, conversations that didn't exist before. And the next section dives into that shift. Because while the public argued, the industry began to adapt. And that adaptation didn't come from outrage. It came from acknowledgement. But whether that acknowledgement was enough is still very much up for debate. What changes when an industry realizes it can't unhear what's already been said? Because that's the quiet turn happening beneath the noise. While timelines scroll and opinions clash, something slower and far more consequential starts to move. Not loudly, not cleanly, but deliberately. The kind of movement that doesn't make headlines, yet reshapes how work actually gets done. This chapter isn't about outrage. It's about adjustment. Behind closed doors, conversations begin that would have felt awkward, unnecessary, or even threatening years earlier. Meetings where people finally ask questions that used to get brushed aside. Questions like, how do we make sure no one has to guess what's okay? How do we protect creativity without sacrificing safety? How do we build trust without assuming it? These aren't rhetorical questions anymore. They're operational. And that's the contradiction worth sitting with. Public discourse thrives on extremes. Private change thrives on specifics. So while the internet argues about who should have said what and when, sets quietly introduce processes that didn't exist before. Check-ins, clear language, structured pauses, ways to say stop without having to explain yourself to a room full of people. On paper, it looks simple. In practice, it's revolutionary. Because for decades, the unwritten rule was endurance. You proved your professionalism by not needing guardrails. You showed commitment by absorbing discomfort quietly. And if something felt wrong, the expectation, unspoken but understood, was that you'd manage it on your own. Now that expectation is being challenged. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to matter. Here's where the emotional complexity deepens. For people who live through the old system, change can feel validating and unsettling at the same time. Validating because it acknowledges that confusion and pressure weren't imaginary. Unsettling because it raises a haunting question. If this is better now, what does that say about then? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and it doesn't land evenly. Some people feel relief, some feel guilt, some feel defensive, because change implies responsibility, even when no harm was intended. That's the part many resist. They hear reform as accusation. They hear reflection as condemnation. But systems don't change because individuals are evil. They change because structures are insufficient. And insufficiency thrives in silence, which is why even imperfect conversations can be catalysts. Think about it. No one sat down and decided to create ambiguity. It evolved because it was convenient, because it kept things moving, because it avoided awkwardness, and because awkwardness was treated as inefficiency. But avoiding awkwardness doesn't avoid harm. It just delays it. So when people start to talk, carefully, imperfectly, sometimes clumsily, it disrupts that delay. And disruption is uncomfortable. On set, these changes look small at first. A meeting before a scene. A conversation that names boundaries instead of assuming them. A clear signal that comfort isn't an obstacle to performance. It's a foundation for it. And that last part is crucial. Because there's a lingering fear that structure will kill spontaneity. That rules will suffocate art. That safety will dilute intensity. But the reality emerging from these changes is more nuanced. When boundaries are clear, trust deepens. When trust deepens, risk becomes safer to take. When risk is safer, performances don't shrink. They sharpen. That's the irony no one talks about. Structure doesn't eliminate authenticity. It protects it. And yet, adopting these changes forces people to revisit old assumptions about how great work is made. It forces a reckoning with the idea that discomfort was ever necessary. Which brings us back to the personal cost. For someone who lived through an ambiguous environment and later voiced discomfort, watching the industry adapt can be bittersweet. It confirms that the questions were valid. But it also confirms that the protections came too late to change the past. You can't retroactively rewrite experience. You can only contextualize it. And contextualization isn't the same as closure. Because even as systems improve, the public conversation lags behind. It remains obsessed with verdicts instead of lessons. It wants to know who won and who lost, not what was learned. That gap between progress and perception creates tension. The industry moves forward quietly. The audience stays stuck arguing loudly. And people caught in the middle feel it. Because progress doesn't erase scrutiny. If anything, it intensifies it. Every new policy becomes retroactive evidence. Every safeguard becomes a question mark pointed at the past. Why wasn't this done before? Who benefited from it not being done? Who paid the price? Those questions don't disappear just because procedures change. They linger, and they complicate everything. This is where responsibility gets slippery. Who is responsible for a culture? Who is responsible for noticing when it fails someone? Who is responsible for fixing it? The answer is rarely a single person. But public narratives love singular villains and heroes. They struggle with shared accountability. So while institutions make incremental changes, individuals remain under a microscope. Every interview, every quote, every silence. And that creates another contradiction. The very changes meant to reduce pressure can increase it for those already associated with the conversation. Because now, anything they say, or don't say, gets measured against a shifting standard. If they acknowledge growth, they're asked why it took so long. If they stay quiet, they're accused of avoidance. If they speak carefully, they're accused of calculation. There's no neutral ground, which is why many people step back entirely. Not because they don't care, but because engaging further feels like pouring water into a fire and being blamed for the steam. So the story continues without them. It evolves through policy updates, training modules, and behind-the-scenes adjustments that rarely make the news. It evolves in rehearsal rooms where consent is discussed openly. It evolves in language that replaces assumption with agreement. And quietly, the baseline shifts. If I didn't see it clearly then, how much do I trust my memory now? That question doesn't just apply to one person. It ripples outward. Colleagues begin to reassess their own recollections. Some stand by them firmly. Others hesitate. Others admit they're not sure anymore. And uncertainty, once introduced, spreads. Because certainty is comforting. Uncertainty is corrosive. The public doesn't like uncertainty, so it fills the gaps. Speculation turns into theory. Theory turns into narrative. Narrative turns into assumed truth. And the more a theory circulates, the harder it becomes to challenge, even if it started as a question. This is the moment where nostalgia fractures. People who once watched the show for comfort now feel conflicted. They wonder whether enjoying it makes them complicit in something they don't fully understand. They ask whether it's okay to separate art from process. They argue about whether you should even rewatch it all. And here's the contradiction that sits at the center of all of this. Art doesn't come with footnotes. It doesn't explain the conditions under which it was made. It doesn't annotate power dynamics or emotional labor. It presents a finished product and asks to be consumed as if it exists in a vacuum. But once the vacuum breaks, you can't put the air back. And the people who made the art are left grappling with something they never signed up for. They signed up to act, to collaborate, to perform. They didn't sign up to have their every gesture retroactively interpreted as testimony. Yet here we are. This is where the line between accountability and projection gets blurry. Accountability asks hard questions about systems and safeguards. Projection assigns intention based on outcome. And online spaces are not known for making that distinction carefully. So reactions intensify. Some viewers feel betrayed. They say the show is ruined for them. Others push back, accusing critics of overreach, of reading too much into fiction, of imposing modern standards on past work. And both sides feel justified, because both are reacting emotionally, not analytically. That emotional charge fuels engagement. Engagement fuels algorithms. Algorithms reward certainty and outrage. Nuance disappears again. And in that environment, even silence becomes content. If someone doesn't respond to a viral clip, that absence is interpreted as guilt or fear. If someone responds cautiously, that caution is framed as evasion. There's no way to opt out. The past has been reopened, and it's not asking politely. This is where the toll deepens for those at the center of it. Because now, the experience isn't just being discussed. It's being consumed. Your discomfort becomes a thread. Your reflection becomes a reaction video. Your uncertainty becomes a debate topic. And every time you open your phone, there it is. Recontextualized, reframed, removed from your original intent. That kind of exposure can make people retreat inward again. Not into silence, but into guardedness. Because once you've seen how easily your story can be reshaped, you become careful with language. Maybe too careful. And that carefulness gets misread as calculation. Which brings us to another uncomfortable reality. People expect trauma narratives to be linear. Clear beginning, clear violation, clear aftermath. But lived experience rarely cooperates. Discomfort can be cumulative. Pressure can be subtle. Recognition can be delayed. And when someone says, "I didn't realize what this was until later," that doesn't mean nothing happened. It means understanding evolved. But evolution doesn't fit well into comment sections. So the narrative splits again. Some argue that delayed recognition invalidates the experience. Others argue it confirms the presence of power dynamics. Both sides speak past each other. And in the middle is a person trying to articulate something that never fit cleanly into words to begin with. That's the cruel irony of rewatch culture. It promises clarity, but often delivers oversimplification. Because a clip can't tell you what was said beforehand. It can't tell you what was assumed. It can't tell you what someone felt obligated to accept. It can only show you what the camera captured. And cameras lie by omission all the time. So what's left? A swirl of interpretation. A backlog of unresolved questions. A growing discomfort with how easily we turn human experiences into consumable puzzles. This is where some people begin to step back and ask a different kind of question. Not, what does this clip prove? But, why are we so desperate for proof? Why do we demand visual confirmation of discomfort before we take it seriously? Why do we trust edited footage more than lived testimony? Why does hindsight feel more authoritative than context? Those questions don't trend, but they linger, and they matter, because the hunger for proof often ignores the reality that power rarely leaves fingerprints. It operates through expectation, momentum, and silence, through what feels easier to go along with than to challenge. That's not something you can always point to in a frame-by-frame breakdown. And yet, the internet keeps trying. Which brings us to the next fracture. Because as rewatching intensifies, pressure builds for definitive answers. For someone to step in and say, once and for all, what those moments meant. And that pressure doesn't just target one person. It spreads to cast members, to creators, to anyone associated with the project. People are asked to comment on scenes they may not remember clearly, to speak on experiences that weren't theirs, to validate or dismiss interpretations they never anticipated. And suddenly, everyone is being asked to testify, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. That's when lines get drawn. And those lines don't just divide audiences, they divide relationships. Because when public narratives collide with private loyalties, people are forced into impossible positions. Support a colleague and risk backlash. Stay neutral and be accused of indifference. Speak honestly and have your words weaponized. There's no safe option. And that's where this story shifts again. Because the rewatch didn't just change how audiences see the show. It changed how people involved see each other. Conversations get quieter. Trust gets strained. Old assumptions get revisited with new suspicion. And once suspicion enters, even innocent memories feel unstable. That instability doesn't explode outward. It implodes inward. And that implosion sets the stage for the next phase. Because when reflection, reaction, and reinterpretation collide long enough, something gives. Either clarity emerges or relationships fracture. And the next section of this story isn't about clips or comments. It's about what happens when people involved are finally forced to confront each other's truths. Not publicly, privately. And those conversations changed more than anyone expected. What happens when the conversation finally leaves the internet and enters the room? Because that's the moment everything becomes real again. Not theoretical, not performative, not filtered through comments and algorithms. Just people. With memories that don't line up neatly. With emotions that never fit into headlines. With the weight of years sitting between what happened and what's being said about it now. This is the part no one sees. After all the noise, after the speculation, after the endless rewatching and reinterpreting, something unavoidable happens. The people involved realize that public narratives are starting to rewrite private relationships. And once that line is crossed, silence stops being protection. It becomes distance. So conversations begin. Quiet ones. Careful ones. Conversations that don't happen on podcasts or red carpets. Conversations where there are no microphones to perform for and no audience to persuade. And those conversations are messy, because this is where a truth most people avoid finally surfaces. You can listen and still disagree. You can care and still feel misunderstood. You can empathize and still not recognize the version of events being discussed. That doesn't make anyone dishonest. It makes the situation complicated. Imagine sitting across from someone and realizing that the moment that's haunted you for years barely registered for them at all. That something you've replayed endlessly lived in their memory as routine, forgettable, insignificant. That realization can hurt more than conflict, because it suggests that the impact wasn't mutual. An impact doesn't require intent. That's one of the hardest lessons to accept in any reckoning. You don't need to mean harm to cause it. You don't need to remember harm for it to exist. But saying that out loud changes the dynamic immediately. Because now the conversation isn't about defending actions. It's about acknowledging outcomes. And acknowledgement is uncomfortable when it threatens how you see yourself. So some conversations stall. Some get tense. Some get emotional. Some end with more questions than answers. But even the ones that don't resolve anything still matter. Because they do something the public debate never could. They humanize the conflict again. Online, people become symbols. Privately, they're just people trying to understand why the same experience feels so different depending on who's describing it. This is where expectations collide. One side may hope for validation. Another may hope for reassurance. And neither may fully get what they're looking for. Because validation doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes as silence. Sometimes as hesitation. Sometimes as a quiet, "I didn't know you felt that way." And that sentence can land in two completely opposite ways. For one person, it's relief. For another, it's devastation. Relief, because it acknowledges ignorance rather than malice. Devastation, because it confirms that no one noticed when it mattered most. That's the emotional crossroads. And there's no universal map for navigating it. Some people walk away feeling lighter. Some feel heavier. Some feel unresolved, but less alone. What almost everyone feels is changed. Because once a private conversation cracks open old assumptions, you can't go back to how things were before, even if you want to. That's when another layer of grief appears. Grief not just for the discomfort itself, but for the version of the past you carried with you. The version where things were simpler, where questions didn't linger, where the story made sense. Now, the story is fragmented. And fragmentation is exhausting. This is also where responsibility becomes more personal and less abstract. It's easy to talk about systems. It's harder to talk about yourself within those systems. To ask, what did I overlook? What did I normalize? What would I do differently now? Those questions don't demand public answers. They demand internal ones. And that's where growth actually happens. Quietly, unevenly, without applause. But growth doesn't guarantee repair. Some relationships don't survive this kind of re-examination. Not because of hatred, but because trust doesn't always regenerate once it's been destabilized. Trust needs shared understanding. And sometimes, understanding comes too late. That's another reality people don't like to admit. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Not every conversation brings closure. Not every acknowledgement heals the wound it names. Sometimes, all you get is clarity. And clarity can still hurt. But it's different from confusion. Confusion traps you in loops. Clarity lets you move forward, even if the direction isn't the one you hoped for. This is where the emotional center of the story shifts. It's no longer about what the audience thinks. It's no longer about defending or accusing. It's about integrating the experience into your sense of self without letting it define you entirely. That's not easy work, especially when the public conversation keeps pulling you backward. Every time a new article drops, every time a clip resurfaces, every time someone decides the story needs another round of commentary, it reopens things you're trying to process privately. And that tension between internal processing and external noise becomes the defining struggle. Some people withdraw completely from the discourse. Some set boundaries around what they'll engage with. Some decide that speaking once was enough. And that decision, too, gets judged. Silence is interpreted as guilt or avoidance. Engagement is interpreted as self-interest or damage control. There's no version that satisfies everyone. So the only option left is to choose what satisfies you. That choice isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It looks like focusing on work differently, like prioritizing environments that feel safer, like recognizing red flags earlier and trusting your instincts faster. It looks like growth that doesn't announce itself. And in that sense, the story moves into a different phase, one where the past still exists, but it no longer dominates every frame. One where reflection becomes a tool rather than a wound. One where the question isn't who was right, but what did this teach me? And that question has 100 answers. About power, about communication, about the cost of silence and the risk of speech. But there's one lesson that sits beneath all the others. Discomfort ignored doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for language. It waits for context. It waits for a moment when it's finally safe or necessary to be acknowledged. And when that moment comes, it rarely looks heroic. It looks human, which brings us to the next turn in this story. Because after the private conversations, after the emotional reckonings, after the attempts at understanding, something else happens. People start asking not just how this happened, but how to make sure it doesn't keep happening. And that question shifts the focus away from individuals entirely, toward systems, toward training, toward responsibility that doesn't rely on bravery alone. And the next section dives into that shift. Because the real legacy of this story won't be found in comments or clips. It will be found in what changes because of it. And whether those changes are enough is still an open question. What happens when prevention becomes the priority instead of damage control? Because this is the moment where the story stops orbiting around one experience and starts pulling the lens back. Wide, structural, Uncomfortable in a different way. This is where the question changes. Not who said what, not who felt what, but how an entire system allowed ambiguity to become normal. For years, the industry relied on an unspoken agreement that adults would manage their own boundaries, that professionalism meant endurance, that anything short of outright misconduct was simply part of the creative process. And for a long time, that agreement went mostly unquestioned, until it didn't. What's striking is how quickly language shifts once systems decide to take responsibility. Suddenly, the things that were once assumed become formalized. What was once implied becomes explicit. What was once figure it out as you go becomes, let's talk about this first. That shift doesn't happen because people suddenly become more sensitive. It happens because too many stories accumulate to ignore. Not identical stories, not perfectly aligned narratives, but stories that rhyme. Different sets, different shows, different people, same patterns, pressure without clarity, expectation without consent, intensity without guardrails. And once those patterns are named, pretending they're isolated becomes impossible. This is where training enters the picture. Not the kind of training that checks a box. Not a single seminar everyone half listens to before going back to work, but ongoing conversations built into the process. Conversations that treat emotional safety as part of the job, not an optional add-on. And that alone represents a seismic shift, because it reframes what professionalism actually means. Professionalism used to mean not complaining, not slowing things down, not drawing attention to yourself. Now, professionalism is being redefined as communication, as clarity, as mutual agreement before vulnerability is demanded. That's not softness. That's maturity. But redefining professionalism also forces a reckoning with the past. It quietly admits that what was once considered normal wasn't necessarily healthy. And that admission creates friction. Some people welcome it immediately. They recognize how much emotional labor they've been carrying without realizing it. Others feel accused by implication, even if no accusation is made. Because change has a way of feeling personal, even when it's structural. If the system needed fixing, what does that say about those who thrived under it? If new rules are necessary, were old practices flawed? If boundaries now require discussion, were they previously ignored? These questions don't come with easy answers, and they don't land evenly. For newer generations entering the industry, the changes feel like progress. They see protections as standard. They expect clarity. They're less willing to confuse discomfort with dedication. For those who built careers without those protections, the changes can feel like a rebuke, not because they're wrong, but because they imply that something essential was missing. And acknowledging that gap can bring grief. Grief for moments that were navigated alone. Grief for confusion that was normalized. Grief for the belief that silence was strength. That grief doesn't always express itself cleanly. Sometimes it comes out as resistance. Sometimes as skepticism. Sometimes as dismissal of the entire conversation. That resistance often sounds like this. We did fine without all this. This is overcorrection. This is going to ruin creativity. But here's the contradiction those arguments rarely confront. Creativity doesn't thrive on fear. It never has. Fear might produce results, but results aren't the same as sustainability. Burnout isn't a badge of honor. Confusion isn't chemistry. Silence isn't consent. And once those distinctions become part of the mainstream conversation, they're hard to unlearn. This is where the story takes on a longer horizon, because the real impact of these changes won't be measured in headlines or viral moments. It will be measured years from now, in environments where people feel safer naming discomfort early instead of processing it alone later. It will be measured in how often misunderstandings are prevented instead of reinterpreted. It will be measured in how many people don't have to look back years later and say, I didn't know how to talk about this then. That's a legacy you don't see immediately, but it's powerful. Still, this shift comes with a cost. Because systems don't change in a vacuum. They change because people push, speak, reflect, even when it's uncomfortable. And those people often become symbols, whether they want to or not. They get associated with the change itself. And that association can be heavy. Because once your story becomes part of a broader reckoning, it's no longer just yours. It's referenced, cited, compared, sometimes simplified in ways that don't reflect how complex it actually was. That's the price of progress no one really prepares you for. You don't just contribute to change. You get carried by it. And being carried means losing some control, which is why some people involved in these conversations step back once systems start adapting. Not because they don't care, but because the work has shifted.